Arousal is the intensity of a specific behavior in a situation. This depends on the degree of emotion linked with the situation for that specific person. There are two types of arousal. These are cognitive arousal and somatic arousal. Cognitive arousal is psychological and somatic is physiological. An example of cognitive arousal is in a sporting environment would be a basketball player having to take a free throw to win a semi-final. Because of the severity of the situation, this may cause the individual to feel arousal and anxiety before taking the shot, because it means winning or losing the game. An example of somatic arousal could be a football player feeling arousal from high-intensity um, sports such as football. As hormones and blood flow is increased during sport, meaning that they have a higher level of arousal. Cognitive arousal can either be positive or negative. An example of negative cognitive arousal may be a hockey player negatively self-talking to themselves before an important game. This can have a negative effect on someone's performance. Somatic arousal can also have having an impact on someone's performance, as if someone is under-aroused or over-aroused, they can become unfocused on relevant cues. For example, a golf player may be under-aroused and hit the ball in completely the wrong place because they cannot concentrate on the relevant cues. They may have become under-aroused because the game of golf does not cause an increased cardiac output, increase in hormone production, so arousal may be lower compared to a high-intensity sport like basketball or football. Moving on to the drive theory. The drive theory explains that with a higher amount of arousal, an elite athlete will perform at a higher level. For example, if a basketball player has to shoot a game-winning buzzer beater to win the game, meaning the situation holds a higher arousal for the athlete. According to the drive theory, the athlete will be more likely to score the three-pointer in this situation rather than a low arousal situation. The theory also states that there has to be a pre-existing motor program in the individual to perform the task required. This means that someone who cannot juggle at all is put in a high arousal situation. They will not be able to perform better because they do not have the pre-existing skill. A criticism of this theory is that many elite athletes have failed in high arousal situations before. The England football team is an example of how elite athletes do not perform better under high arousal situations all the time, as they have lost multiple important games to penalty shootouts. The inverted U theory. So this theory states that there are optimum levels of arousal and someone can become under-aroused or over-aroused depending on the situation. If the person is under-aroused, then it may mean that they cannot focus on relevant cues. An example of a relevant cue would be focus on positioning while on defense in rugby. An optimum arousal level allows the athlete to have the maximum potential performance because they are focused, because they are focused and can fully focus on relevant cues in the actual game. For example, a basketball team running a complex play in a match will take everyone working together and taking in relevant cues like positioning, different passes and cuts. If the athlete becomes over-aroused, it can mean that the player enters a state of hypervigilance or a blind panic. This means that, for example, if someone was playing rugby and they kept on getting run past while in defence and kept on missing a tackle on a particular player, it can mean that they can become solely focused on tackling that one player and they cause disadvantages for their team because they are not focused on any of the other relevant cues. This may mean while the athlete trying to tackle the other player goes into a blind panic, it can mean he comes out of position in defence, for example, therefore exposing space for the other team to score. A criticism of the inverted U theory is that it states that the transition from optimum or low arousal to high arousal is gradual, while this is not true as someone can become over-aroused immediately. An example would be an optimally aroused athlete getting into a conflict with the referee because of a bad call. It would mean that the player would immediately become hostile towards the referee after the decision and therefore arousing their arousal levels. The catastrophe theory. This theory states that, quite like the inverted U theory, there are optimum arousal levels for athletes, but this states that while exercising and performance, the individual may experience a catastrophe event within the sport. This may be a conflict or a missed shot, but it's something that usually alters the individual's performance in a negative way. The theory states that once this catastrophe has occurred, the athlete can remain calm and regain the optimum arousal level slowly, but they may sink even more lowly and keep making further mistakes. An example would be a basketball player missing 10 shots in a row, a basketball team, allowing the opposition to get a lead. After this initial catastrophe, it may demotivate the people in the team, and therefore meaning that the other team get even more of a lead and eventually they lose. This is an example of how it can negatively affect performance on a team and an individual. Anxiety, moving on. Anxiety. Anxiety is a negative experience of stress that can be caused by worries of apprehension. It can also come from a fear of failure. This can be applied to sports quite often, as many people may feel anxious or nervous before a match because of the fear they won't win or they won't achieve their personal targets. So there's 4 types of anxiety: cognitive, somatic, trait, and state. So cognitive anxiety, this is known as the psychological effects of anxiety on an individual. This can have a negative effect on someone's performance in a sporting context, as someone may feel apprehensive and nervous before an important game because of the fear they will lose. So that's psychological. Somatic is physiological. So the physiological effects on anxiety on an individual, this will have an effect such as the cardiovascular system's components will rise before playing a match. An example of these would be an increase in heart rate and breathing rate. So that's right before a match. You will have some sort of anxiety if you're, depending on the severity of the game. Say if it was a final, then people are more likely to be anxious before the game because it means a lot more than, say, just a friendly game between two teams. So, trait anxiety. Trait anxiety is described as a general disposition to perceive situations as a threat, even when they may hold no danger. This may be someone with a naturally anxious personality and perceive most situations being a threat. This can be applied to both a social setting and a sporting environment. An example of this may be a football player being scared to take a penalty in training because of the fear of failing in front of others. So that's, even if it's a training session, they're still scared to make mistakes, and it shows that how even if it's not a threatful situation, it's not a situation with anything on the line, they still perceive it to be have some sort of threat or danger to it. So state anxiety, this is the immediate response to a specific situation. In state anxiety, it means that there is a different amount of anxiety experienced for a different situation depending on the individual and the environment they are in. For example, a netball player may not be more anxious in a high-level game like a semi-final or a final than in training. Trait anxiety means that someone will have varying degrees of anxiety depending on the setting. This can be applied to social setting and sports situations. Moving on to anxiety management techniques. So, deep breathing. Deep breathing is one way to control anxiety. Deep breathing enables the performer to decrease the heart rate and increase the amount of oxygen being transported to the muscles around the body. Deep breathing also allows an athlete to gain composure before performing a certain task. Deep breathing cannot be used while performing, and the exercise will have to be stopped before you can use this technique, which is the only downside because within a game you can't just stop because your team will have a disadvantage, or if it's an individual sport, your opponent will have an advantage if you just start breathing. Practicing means that when you're coming to play a game, the skills that you're practicing have become more readily available for you to use, and now you will not feel anxious about performing because you have developed an understanding of how to carry out the specific skills. An example could be a layup in basketball. If someone is not confident, they will be anxious about trying it in a match, whereas if they practice, it means that they will not feel as anxious because they will be able to perform the move with more ease. Positive self-talk can be motivating the individual to perform better. Positive self-talk can usually occur days and hours before the match happens, and it can put individuals in a positive mindset for the game, and therefore altering their performance levels in a good way. Moving on to stress. So what is stress? Stress is defined as a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. All of us feel stress as individuals, but in varying different degrees. For different circumstances and situations, it is dependent on how the individual perceives the situation. An individual may feel a low amount of stress in a certain situation, and someone else may experience a higher amount of stress in this repeated situation. This means that stress is often subjective and situational, but it is common for people to experience even a small amount of stress every day. Stress is caused by a main stressor. The stressor is defined as the main source of stress, anxiety, and arousal the individual feels at any one time. So, eustress and distress. Eustress is defined as a positive form of stress that has a beneficial effect on the individual. It also increases intrinsic motivation. Athletes seek out eustress as it is said to give a sense of fulfillment. An example of this would be an individual completing a marathon as it is a challenging task and therefore can give them a sense of fulfillment afterwards. And distress is the opposite. This is the negative form of stress and is described as an extreme feeling of anxiety, nervousness, and apprehension and worry. This is usually due to the fact that the person themselves not meeting their personal demands. So an example might be a basketball player wanted to go and score 20 points in a game and they only got 11, and they might feel distress after the game because they have not lived up to their own personal goal. When choosing to exercise, many people have to overcome certain barriers to carry out said exercises. These include physical, psychological, personal, environmental, and activity-related, which can stop people exercising. These can be a lack of motivation, money, accessibility, time, and many more factors. The perceived benefits from the exercise and the perceived severity of the sport can also cause people not to participate in sport if they do not think the rewards of the exercise justify actually working in the sport. So, say someone wanted to have some weight loss, but they didn't want to put in the work. They didn't want to work hard enough to do it, and that would be a barrier to exercise. So yeah, and then also the perceived severity of the exercise can also stop someone from exercising, because if they think it's going to be too challenging, then they are more inclined not to start it. So moving on to this the survey we created. So to find out how many people experience these barriers to exercise, we created this survey to find out what people experience when trying to exercise. The following questions were included in the survey. So how often do you exercise? How long do you exercise for? What are the reasons for starting exercise? What influences you the most to exercise? Would you start a new exercise if you found it challenging? Do your friends influence your sport of choice? And have you ever taken part in an exercise program? If so, why did you start the exercise program? Did you quit the exercise program after joining? If so, why? Do you know the benefits of exercise? Would you start exercise if you knew it reduced risks of a particular disease? And what would stop you from participating in a sport? And why does this stop you from participating? So, moving on to the three theories for basically behavioural change when starting exercise. So the first one is trans-theoretical model. So the trans-theoretical model states that there are 6 stages to exercise and creating an exercise-based lifestyle, or creating a routine that incorporates exercise into your lifestyle. So it's got 6 stages. Pre-contemplation stage is where you're not aware, uninformed, and you've got no intention to change. Contemplation, aware problems exist, are thinking about changing. Preparation is intention to take action to change. Action is make modifications in their behaviour. Maintenance have made modifications prevent relapse, which is preventing, obviously, in a sport situation, that's preventing not stopping. And termination is where you have ended your exercise.